They say the ocean keeps its secrets, that its darkness remembers what the light forgets. But there is one secret the sea has carried longer than all others, a secret older than pyramids, older than cities, older than any story written by human hands, a secret whispered not by waves, but by a philosopher who sat in the stillness of ancient Athens and opened a doorway into a world that should not have existed. Atlantis, the word itself feels like a pulse beneath the water, soft, cold, inevitable, but before it became a legend, it was an account. Before it became a myth, it was a memory. Before it belonged to dreamers and believers, it belonged to one man, sitting in the quiet glow of his thoughts. Plato. He did not claim to imagine Atlantis. He claimed to inherit it, not from a poet, not from a storyteller, but from Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, a man known less for fantasy and more for the discipline of truth. Solon, Plato said, travelled to Egypt nearly 2 centuries earlier. He walked into temples where history extended not in centuries, but in millennia, where stone recorded what paper could not, where time was measured not by kings, but by floods, stars, and the slow, patient breath of civilization. There, priests spoke to him softly, as if afraid that the weight of their words could fracture the world he came from. They told him that the Greeks were children, that their histories were too young, their memories too short, their catastrophes too many, to preserve the truth of what came before. And then, as if opening a sealed chamber of time, they revealed a story buried beneath 9,000 years of dust. A story of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a land larger than Libya and Asia combined, a civilization arranged in rings, circles of land, circles of sea, perfect, deliberate, impossible. They spoke of canals that sliced through the earth, with precision no empire of Solon's time could match, of walls plated in metals whose names have nearly vanished from human tongues, of ships that crossed oceans like migrating storms, of 10 kings who ruled in harmony, meeting every few years, beneath a temple dedicated to Poseidon himself, and they told him how that world fell. In a single day, in a single night, swallowed not by war, but by the sea itself. It is here at this moment that Plato asks us to decide whether we believe what he was told, or merely follow the echo of his thought, because his account is too clear, too precise, too measured, to be dismissed as simple myth. He gives dates, he gives numbers, he gives geography, he gives lineage, architecture, law, harvest schedules, military divisions. He gives structure, not dream, and yet the very precision of his telling makes it feel even more unreal. What kind of civilization existed 9,000 years before Solon, before the pyramids, before Sumer, before writing, before metal, before history itself had a name? Who were these people? Who built rings of land glowing in orichalcum? Who dug canals hundreds of feet wide? Who marched in armies that counted in the hundreds of thousands? Who carved temples that dwarfed anything standing in Plato's world? It is too much, too grand, too old, and yet too specific to ignore. Atlantis lives in this contradiction, balance between belief and disbelief, between memory and metaphor, between the world we know and the world we fear we might have lost. But here is the truth that hooks the mind and refuses to let go. Plato did not finish the story. His dialogue ends mid-sentence, mid-thought, like a flame blown out by a sudden wind. Was the ending lost, or did he leave it unfinished on purpose? A deliberate silence, shaped to provoke imagination and unsettle certainty? We do not know. But the unfinished edge is what keeps the story breathing. It leaves a gap, a void, a quiet place where questions gather like mist. Why would Plato, so careful, so thorough, so exact, let the story collapse into silence? Unless the silence was the point. Unless Atlantis was never meant to be answered, only pursued. Never meant to be closed, only entered. Because the moment you hear it, truly hear it, something shifts inside you. A small, electric doubt, a soft opening in the mind, a feeling that history may not be what it seems, that our timeline might be missing entire chapters, that humanity may have risen before, and fallen before, and forgotten before. Atlantis presses a strange question upon the soul. What if we are not the pinnacle of civilization, but merely the latest survivors of a cycle we barely understand? Plato hints at this quietly, beneath the surface of his words. He says Athens once stood as a model of virtue, a city untouched by greed, unshaken by excess. And it was this ancient Athens that stood against the empire of Atlantis. Two civilizations, two destinies, one destroyed by its own corruption, one preserved through virtue. But virtue fades, memory dims, and history like tides erases even its own footprints. If Plato intended this as warning, it is a warning whispered from the threshold of time, not shouted, not forced, simply placed gently into our hands and left for us to feel. And maybe that is why Atlantis endures, because beneath its grand architecture, beneath its impossible canals, beneath its shimmering walls, lies a truth so simple, so intimate, that it brushes against every life. Greatness is fragile, civilizations are mortal, and forgetting is easier than we think. This is why the story has followed us for millennia, why explorers, scholars, mystics, and dreamers have chased it across oceans and continents, why it appears in our films, books, games, and collective imagination, why it refuses to die. Because Atlantis is not just a lost city, it is a reflection of our fears, our ambitions, our memory, our longing, a mirror held to humanity by the hand of a philosopher who understood that sometimes the most powerful truths must be told as stories. And so, before we dive deeper, before we follow the rings of Atlantis, before we walk its harbours and temples, before we stand inside its destruction, pause for a moment. Listen to the silence between Plato's last written word and the word that never came after. That silence is where the truth begins. If you feel it, if something in you stirs, if the mystery pulls you forward, then stay with me. And before we continue this journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to create more stories like this, stories that whisper instead of shout, that slow the mind, that soften the breath, and guide you gently into wonder and into sleep. We begin now, and as we step across that threshold, something subtle begins to unfold, a feeling not of entering a story, but of remembering one, as if the tale of Atlantis is not being told to you for the first time, but stirred from some quiet chamber of the mind, where forgotten things sleep. Because Atlantis does that, it awakens echoes, soft ones, slow ones, echoes that feel older than any language you know, older than your name, older than the life you remember living. There is a strange familiarity in its shape, in the circles of land, in the gleaming metal, in the rising towers above the sea, a familiarity that should not exist, yet settles into you like a memory, half formed, half faded, as if part of you once walked those rings, once touched those stones, once watched the horizon, from a place that no longer appears on any map. This is the quiet pull of the Atlantis myth. Not the promise of secrets, but the sense that the secret is already inside you, waiting to be recognized. And through Plato's words, as measured as they are mysterious, you begin to see something deeper than temples or armies or islands swallowed by the sea. You begin to see the shadow of a question humanity has carried longer than history. Have we lived before, in ways the world no longer remembers? Has civilization risen and fallen, in cycles erased by time, by water, by disaster, by forgetfulness? Or is Atlantis not a memory of the past, but a warning for the future, a soft reminder that knowledge without wisdom always ends the same way? These questions do not come suddenly. They drift toward you like dim shapes through deep water, slow, fluid, almost shy. They are questions meant not for the waking mind, but for the quiet mind, the mind that listens between breaths, the mind that hears before it thinks. And as they settle, you begin to notice something else. A stillness, a softness, the same softness that lives in Plato's unfinished sentence, the same softness that lingers when a story chooses to end in silence rather than certainty. That silence carries its own weight, its own gravity, its own invitation. It asks you to imagine what Plato did not write, what Solon could not finish, what the Egyptian priests may have believed, but never fully revealed. It asks you to listen not for answers, but for resonance, because Atlantis, in its quietest form, is not about a city. It is about a feeling that rises slowly, the way tides rise under the pull of a distant moon, a feeling that tells you the world is older than we admit, more mysterious than we measure, and more fragile than we fear. You may not know what Atlantis truly was. No one does. But in this moment, in this quiet space between words, you know how it feels. It feels like standing at the edge of the sea at night, when the wind is gentle, when the water is dark, when the world is so vast that your breath steadies itself without you even noticing. It feels like remembering something you were never taught, something whispered, not spoken, something ancient, not old. And so the story invites you, not to believe, but to listen, not to solve, but to sense, not to chase Atlantis, but to let Atlantis drift toward you, the way dreams drift toward sleep, slowly, softly, inevitably, because the true beginning of the journey is not in Egypt, or Athens, or the vanished rings of a lost empire. It begins here, in the quiet turning of your own thoughts, in the gentle opening of awareness, in the space where wonder grows, like light beneath deep water. The story continues, but for now, breathe, settle, let the ancient world rise, not as a place you must find, but as a presence, unfolding softly inside you. And when you are ready, we will go deeper. They say some stories do not rise all at once. They return in pulses, in soft waves, in quiet awakenings across different centuries, as if the world itself remembers them, only when the human mind grows still enough to hear the echo. Atlantis is one of those stories. After Plato's voice faded into the dust of ancient Athens, the world drifted on for almost 2,000 years, without looking back at the island he described. Empires rose and fell, wars reshaped continents, new religions covered the earth like shifting constellations. And yet the story of Atlantis slept, unmoving, untouched, waiting. It was not until the modern world, a world buzzing with new machines, new sciences, new anxieties, that the old island began to stir again. It began softly, in quiet rooms filled with lamplight, where people gathered to seek meaning. Beyond the rigid lines of material science, a new desire rose among them, not for conquest, not for power, but for understanding, for something older, something deeper, something the modern world seemed to have lost. In the late 19th century, as factories roared and city lights drowned the stars, a spiritual hunger grew in the Western mind. People felt a quiet ache, a longing for connection to something vast and ancient and unseen. And into that longing, Atlantis returned. It was not Plato who brought it back, but a woman sitting beside a candle flame, writing slowly, carefully, as if listening to voices older than herself. Helena Blavatsky. To some, she was a visionary. To others, a mystic. To many, the first bridge between ancient Eastern wisdom and the modern Western spirit. In her work, Atlantis expanded, not as a city, not as an empire, but as a stage in the evolution of the human soul. She wrote of cycles of humanity, root races, long ages, forgotten epochs stretching behind recorded history. Like continents beneath the sea, Atlantis became not merely a place, but a chapter of existence, a time when human beings lived with abilities that modern minds could barely imagine. Blavatsky speaks of intuition sharpened beyond sight, of energies that moved through the body like quiet currents, of consciousness that could expand beyond the limits of flesh and bone. In her telling, Atlantis did not fall only because of corruption, but because the world itself shifted, closing one doorway and opening another. To her followers, this was not fantasy, it was memory. Not personal memory, but the memory of humanity itself, written into the quiet places of the psyche, where images rise unbidden, like dreams from another lifetime. From this spark, a movement grew. People began to look at the night sky and wonder, not what lay above them, but what lay behind them, behind time, behind history, behind the thin veil of the known world that modern science had stretched like glass, between the mind and the mystery. Atlantis became a symbol, not of loss, but of possibility, a reminder that human potential might be far greater than anyone dared believe, that perhaps the limits we accept are not limits at all, but shadows cast by forgetting. And then another voice entered, a voice quieter, softer, a voice that did not write in dense philosophy or sweeping cosmic frameworks, but spoke from the threshold between waking and sleep. Edgar Cayce, a man who closed his eyes, fell into trance, and emerged with stories that felt older than the languages he spoke. People came to him with illnesses, with confusion, with questions about their lives, and yet again and again, in the stillness of those trances, his words drifted back to the same forgotten shore, Atlantis, not as myth, not as metaphor, but as a lived place, a place, he said, many souls had walked, long before their present lives began. He spoke of temples powered by crystalline energy, of machines that could harness forces the modern world had no names for, of people who used spiritual and material technology as naturally as breathing, a civilization radiant with knowledge, but trembling at the edge of imbalance. In his visions, Atlantis was not destroyed all at once. It declined in waves. 3 great upheavals, each sinking part of the land, to as pride grew, as wisdom faded, as power was used without care. To those who listened, his words felt like returning dreams, dreams that made the world feel larger, stranger, warmer, dreams that suggested the soul might carry memories far older than the body it inhabits. A quiet hope grew from these readings, the hope that what was lost might not be lost forever, that the abilities, intuitions, and sensitivities that once belonged to ancient humanity could rise again within the hearts of those now living. The modern world, restless and hungry, heard these whispers and leaned closer. Atlantis spread like a soft mist, across spiritual circles, across groups seeking healing, across those yearning for meaning. Beyond the cold geometry of modern life, the story became a sanctuary, a place where the human spirit could imagine itself whole again. But something else happened too. Quietly, almost invisibly, Atlantis became personal. Not a distant island in a forgotten ocean, but a mirror held gently up to the listener, a way for people to understand why they sometimes felt out of place, why they carried fears or gifts that did not seem to belong to the world around them. If they felt too sensitive, they wondered if they had lived in a world where sensitivity was strength. If they felt drawn to the ocean, they wondered if they had walked shores, long vanished beneath the waves. If they felt a longing they could not name, they wondered if it was simply the echo of a life before this life. Atlantis gave shape to these feelings, not as answers, but as possibilities, gentle ones, the kind that soothe rather than disturb, the kind that help the mind rest, rather than wander in fear, because the myth of Atlantis, in the hands of mystics and dreamers, became a story not about catastrophe, but about the cycle of forgetting and remembering, the slow turning of human consciousness through ages of light and ages of shadow. People began to believe that the fall of Atlantis was not just a tragedy, but a transition, that humanity moved from one form into another, carrying forward only fragments of what it once knew, fragments that surface, in intuition, in dreams, in moments of clarity, that feel like remembering. This belief created a soft comfort, the comfort of knowing that the soul is older than its struggles, wiser than its doubts, stronger than its wounds. And in that comfort, The myth grew deeper roots, spreading quietly through new spiritual movements in America and Europe. Meditation circles, energy healers, writers of esoteric teachings all found something gentle and powerful within the story of the lost island. Atlantis became a symbol of human potential waiting to return, a symbol of what we might become again if we learn to listen more closely to the quiet currents beneath our thoughts. And perhaps that is why, in the soft places of the mind, just before sleep, just after waking, in the spaces where consciousness drifts open, Atlantis feels less like a myth and more like a memory. Not a memory of stone or ships or shining temples, but a memory of something subtler, a time when humanity lived with deeper intuition, deeper connection, deeper awareness of the invisible patterns shaping the world. A time when knowledge was not only learned, but felt, a time when the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was so thin that people moved between them as easily as breath moves between lungs and air. That is the Atlantis, reborn in the modern age. Not a sunken kingdom, but a quiet reminder that we, too, may hold more within us than we have yet remembered. And as we drift further into this journey, that reminder becomes the soft thread guiding us forward, not with certainty, but with wonder, a wonder that says there is more to us than the world has taught us to see. And perhaps that is why the story continues to rise, not in sudden revelations, but in slow, familiar waves that feel as though they come from within rather than from the world outside. For in the quiet moments, when thought loosens its grip, when the noise of the day softens into distance, something gentle begins to move. A sense of recognition, a subtle knowing that does not belong to logic, yet feels unmistakably true. It is the feeling that humanity has lived more lives than history dares to remember. That consciousness has walked paths long erased from the soil of the earth, yet preserved somewhere in the dim corridors of the spirit. Atlantis, in this modern rebirth, is not a question of archaeology, but a question of identity. Not where was it, but what part of us comes from it. Not did it exist, but why does the story reach so deeply into places within us we did not know were waiting? And slowly, the answer unfolds not as fact, but as feeling. Atlantis survives because it touches the part of the human soul that refuses to believe we are small or accidental or limited to a single lifetime. It survives because it reminds us that the greatness we long for may not lie ahead of us, but behind us, echoing gently from an age we once knew and may one day know again. And so the story moves with us now, quietly, softly, as we continue deeper into the mystery that has followed humanity across centuries of dreams. There comes a moment in every great mystery when imagination and longing meet the cold surface of evidence, a moment when the story must walk toward the light, even if the light is soft and the truth refuses to take shape. For Atlantis, that moment arrived with the rise of modern archaeology. It began quietly, with shovels in the earth, with fragments of pottery lifted from dust that had not been disturbed for thousands of years. The 19th century cracked open the ancient world, as if lifting the lid from a forgotten chest, and what emerged was both wondrous and unsettling. For the first time, humanity had tools to reach backward through time with steady hands. Stratigraphy traced layers of soil, like chapters in the Earth's memory. Radiocarbon dating gave numbers to centuries long lost. Scholars compared civilizations, not through rumor or myth, but through silent shards of clay, through buried walls, through bones and ashes that carried stories without words. And as these tools grew sharper, the question rose again, soft but persistent. If Atlantis truly lived, where are its ruins? The ocean kept its silence, but the land began to speak. In the early 20th century, an English archaeologist named Arthur Evans set foot upon the island of Crete, guided by faint whispers of an ancient civilization that predated Greek memory. What he found felt at first like an echo of Plato's lost world. Multi-storied palaces, rising from the earth like ghosts of vanished grandeur. Frescoes painted with spiraling reds and blues, alive with dolphins, lilies, and flowing lines. Labyrinthine halls that carried the quiet breath of a forgotten kingdom. And beneath these walls, complex drainage systems, plumbing, storage chambers, evidence of a society that understood abundance and order. Evans called them the Minoans, and for a time the world wondered if Atlantis had finally been found. The Minoans lived on an island. They flourished in peace. They commanded ships that moved across the Mediterranean, like veins of a living sea. Their engineering hinted at brilliance. Their art glowed with life. Their sudden fall whispered of catastrophe. It was all so close. Close enough that many let themselves imagine that these ruins were the edges of Plato's lost rings. Close enough that hope drifted like mist above the excavation pits, where sunlight touched ancient stone. But the deeper the archaeologists dug, the more the resemblance dissolved. The dates did not match. The scale did not match. The geography, the culture, the politics, all drifted apart from Plato's words, like sand slipping through fingers. And so the Minoans remained, magnificent, but not Atlantis. Yet the search did not end. Not long after, attention turned to another civilization, the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, a people of fortified palaces, bronze armour, warlike kings, and vast trade networks. They too carried an aura of power. Their citadels rose like stone memories of a world half legendary. Their ships reached distant shores. Their collapse was sudden and mysterious. For a moment, the imagination leapt again. Could this be the empire Plato had mistaken for Atlantis? Could their stories, carried from age to age, have grown into the tale of a world swallowed by the sea? But once more, the evidence answered softly, but firmly. The Mycenaeans lived too late, died too late, never ruled the oceans as Plato's Atlantis had, never claimed lands beyond the horizon. Their world was grand, but not the grandness the story demanded. And so Atlantis slipped again, into the spaces between possibilities neither confirmed nor disproven, but simply out of reach. Then, in the mid-20th century, the ocean itself entered the conversation. Oceanographers mapped the seafloor with newfound clarity. Sonar traced the shapes of underwater mountains and plains so deep that light had long abandoned them. In these maps, some hoped to find a sunken continent, a drowned plateau, the bones of a lost world, resting beneath miles of dark water. But what they found were ridges shaped by volcanic birth, valleys carved by time, and plains that had always been plains. No cities, no walls, no unnatural geometric shapes, hidden beneath the waves. The ocean, quiet and ancient, gave nothing away. On land, however, another revelation awaited. Far north of Crete, the island of Santorini slept within a ring of cliffs that once formed the mouth of a volcano. In the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, excavations uncovered a city buried beneath ash. Akrotiri, preserved rooms, painted walls, furniture still standing, where it had been left 3,000 years earlier. The ash had sealed time itself, turning a day of terror into a museum of silence. And when the world saw Akrotiri, it felt the pulse of Atlantis again, because here, too, was beauty. Here, too, was sophistication. Here, too, was sudden destruction. But again, the details refused to align. Santorini's fall was dramatic, but not ancient enough. Its reach was wide, but not global enough. Its story was tragic, but not the tragedy Plato described. These ruins whispered of a civilization shattered by nature, but not of an age swallowed by the sea in a single night of fate. And so Atlantis withdrew again, not disproven, not diminished, but simply quiet. What, then, did this century of searching truly reveal? Not the ruins of Atlantis, but the truth that the ancient world was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Civilizations rose and fell, with patterns we did not expect. Some built aqueducts long before others learned to shape metal. Some carved cities from cliffs. Some mastered trade across waters, thought impassable. Some vanished suddenly, with no explanation the earth would give. And in each discovery, the modern age realized how little it truly knew, how fragile assumptions were, how vast the tapestry of human history might be. Atlantis did not shrink in this light. It grew, for every ruin that was not Atlantis proved something deeper, that the world could indeed forget whole civilizations for thousands of years, that entire cultures could lie hidden beneath soil, beneath ash, beneath the slow turning of time. Atlantis, then, was not disproven. It was placed gently into a new kind of possibility. Perhaps Plato exaggerated. Perhaps he inherited a distorted story. Perhaps the truth was smaller, or larger, or simply different than what words could hold. But archaeology taught the world to see Atlantis not as an outlier, but as one more echo in the long chorus of civilizations rising and fading, like breath. And this is where the story softens again, because in the end, what archaeology revealed was not just the ruins that exist, but the ones that might still sleep beneath oceans or deserts, or lands reshaped by time. It revealed how easily the earth can swallow memory, how quietly history can close its doors, how entire cultures can disappear without leaving their names behind. And in that quiet understanding, Atlantis begins to feel less like an impossible myth and more like a story that simply has not yet found its place. A story waiting beneath silt, beneath currents, beneath centuries of forgetting. A story that may still rise when the world grows still enough to listen. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath all the digging, all the mapping, all the careful brushing of dust from ancient stone, that the world does not give up its deepest stories simply because we ask for them. Some truths wait, some truths resist, some truths reveal themselves only when the mind is steady enough and gentle enough to hear what lies beneath the silence. For even as archaeologists lifted artifacts from the ground and catalogued every fragment with patient hands, something deeper remained untouched, the mystery of why Atlantis refuses either to appear or to disappear. Most myths crumble when stripped of their symbols. Most legends fade when measured against fact. But Atlantis does neither. Instead, it hovers in the narrow space between what is known and what is possible. And in that space, the imagination does something delicate. It listens. Archaeology showed us ruins we never expected to find. Cities older than scripture. Craftsmen whose skills rivaled the modern age. Networks of trade that stretched farther than our textbooks once dared to write. Time and again, the earth opened its hand and revealed worlds far grander and far stranger than anyone had predicted. So the question changed. It softened. It turned inward. If such marvels existed, forgotten for thousands of years, then who can say what else sleeps beneath layers of time, thicker than ash? Who can say which memories have already drifted beyond reach, or which may rise again in some future excavation? When a shovel sinks just 1 inch deeper than all the shovels before it, the world is old, older than our stories, older than our doubts, older than every assumption we build our understanding upon. And in that vastness, Atlantis becomes less of a question and more of an invitation, not to find a city, but to recognize how much of history remains unremembered. Maybe the ruins are gone. Maybe the ocean has taken them into a depth from which nothing returns. Or maybe they lie somewhere still, beneath a coastline altered by time, beneath a desert once drowned in water, beneath a field that looks ordinary until someone shifts a handful of soil and feels the faint outline of a world that should not have been forgotten. And so we continue, not because proof is guaranteed, but because the silence still feels unfinished, and because some stories, like Atlantis, do not end. When evidence fails, they deepen. There is a certain kind of hope that refuses to die, a hope that moves quietly, beneath the surface of reason, beneath the weight of evidence, beneath the slow, patient progress of scientific understanding. Atlantis lives inside that hope, for even after archaeologists searched the land and found wonders but not the one they sought, the story drifted toward the sea, toward the deepest places, where sunlight dissolves into endless blue. It was the ocean, after all, that Plato named as the keeper of the island, and so humanity followed that whisper into new realms of exploration that the ancient world could never have imagined. The 20th century brought machines capable of descending into darkness that no human eye had ever seen. Sonar painted pictures beneath miles of water. Submersibles drifted through quiet cathedrals of pressure and shadow. The ocean floor, once unreachable, became a map slowly unfolding before the modern mind, and with each new tool, the longing stirred again. If Atlantis had sunk, then surely it must lie somewhere beneath these waters, waiting, resting, enduring. It was this longing that shaped the next chapter of the search. For in 1968, off the coast of a small island in the Bahamas, divers found something that sent a tremor through the world of mystery. Rectangular blocks of stone, massive and aligned, stretching beneath the waves, like the remains of a road, leading nowhere and everywhere. They called it the Bimini Road. Photographs drifted across newspapers and into the minds of people, already listening for any faint echo of Atlantis. The stones looked too straight, to be natural, too precise, too intentional. And once again, that old familiar whisper rose. Could this be it? For a moment, the world leaned forward. Hope brightened. The imagination lifted its face toward possibility. But the ocean, patient as ever, held its truth silently. When geologists arrived, they knelt beside those stones with the same care one reserves for ancient artifacts. They traced the edges, studied the patterns, measured the fractures, and slowly a different story emerged. The stones were natural, limestone broken along straight bedding planes, repeated by the rhythm of geological time. The shapes were coincidences of pressure and erosion, nothing more. No hands had carved them. No civilization had laid them down. The road dissolved back into rock, but hope did not dissolve with it. For just as Bimini faded from certainty, another shape rose from another ocean. Halfway around the world, beneath the waters of Yonaguni, divers found a structure that seemed carved from the bones of the earth itself. Terraces, steps, massive flat plains, angled like architecture from a forgotten age. The photographs stirred something deep, a feeling that this time, perhaps, the sea had finally chosen to give up one of its secrets. But again, geology spoke softly and steadily. Yonaguni's shapes were the work of tectonic forces, not ancient masons, layered sandstone fractures that broke in right angles, as naturally as crystals grow, and yet, even with these explanations, something remained. Why did these structures evoke Atlantis so powerfully? Why did so many look at them and feel a spark of recognition? Perhaps it was not the stones themselves, but the longing they awakened, a longing older than science and deeper than certainty. The ocean floor became a canvas. For that longing, every shadowed ridge and every unexpected formation invited the imagination to speak. Through the decades, reports surfaced again and again. Walls, pyramids, columns, roads, each seeming to offer a piece of the lost world. Some were coral growths, shaped by currents. Some were volcanic rocks, fractured into geometric shapes. Some were tricks of light, illusions born from silt and the drifting body of the sea. And yet, Each time the story appeared, people leaned into it with the same quiet hope, because even if the evidence was fragile, the emotional truth felt steady. The ocean was vast enough to hide anything, and mysteries thrive in vastness. Scientists continued to map the underwater world with increasing clarity. They traced mid-ocean ridges, deep trenches, underwater mountains born from volcanic fire. They found no sunken continent, no drowned empire, no unmistakable city, caught within a grave of silence. And yet there was something unexpected. In learning that Atlantis was not on the seafloor, humanity learned how little it had known about the world it lived on. Entier ecosystems in eternal darkness, thermal vents spewing mineral clouds that glowed like living storms, creatures with translucent bodies, eyes adapted to blackness, shapes so unfamiliar they looked like life from another planet. In this world, Atlantis felt almost small. To a single question, within a universe of questions, the ocean had whispered, but never spoken aloud. And through this revelation, a strange shift occurred. The search for Atlantis began to transform. It was no longer about finding a lost city. It was about understanding the nature of human yearning, the deep desire to believe that somewhere, beneath the surface of what we know, something extraordinary waits. Because even when science gave its explanations, those explanations did not close the story. They simply softened its edges, showing how easily humans see intention in nature, patterns in chaos, architecture in the accidental. This is not a flaw. It is a feature, a sign of the same imagination that once carved myths from constellations and gods from thunder. Atlantis endures, not because of evidence, but because of the part of the mind that continues to dream, even when the world insists on waking, and the dream remains gentle, a dream of a world where knowledge was deep, where nature and technology moved in harmony, where beauty and intelligence were woven into the shape of daily life. A dream not of dominance, but of connection. The ocean reveals only fragments, fragments of geology, fragments of history, fragments of life that hint at ages older and stranger than anything we record. But fragments are enough to keep wonder alive, enough to remind us that certainty is not the only path to truth, enough to whisper, in moments of quiet, that the sea still carries stories we are not yet ready to understand. And so, as underwater archaeology grows deeper, as technology advances, as maps sharpen and images clarify, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Atlantis may not lie on the ocean floor, but it lies in the place where discovery meets longing, a place where the mind drifts between what is known and what might still be waiting, a place where mystery does not diminish, but deepens. And as we move forward into the next chapter of this journey, the sea remains what it has always been, not a grave, but a mirror, reflecting not only the world beneath, but the world within. And maybe that is why the story lingers, not as a destination, but as a motion, not as a discovery, but as a drifting, a slow glide through layers of thought that grow softer the deeper you go. For when the ocean becomes a mirror, you begin to see something unexpected reflected back at you. Not a city of gold, not a ring of perfect canals, not the rise and fall of kings, but something quieter, something more intimate, the shape of your own longing. Because the search for Atlantis has always carried two currents, one moving outward toward distant waters and forgotten ruins, the other moving inward toward the hidden terrain of the human heart. And it is often difficult to know which current is stronger. The explorers who sailed into uncharted waters were not only seeking stone, they were seeking meaning. They were seeking a way to understand their place in a world too vast to comprehend, a world where knowledge expands faster than certainty and where every discovery reveals another mystery, just beyond reach. Atlantis became a vessel for that feeling, a place where the known and unknown touch for a moment and then drift apart. A reminder that no matter how deeply we explore, there will always be something just below the next layer, just beyond the next horizon, waiting in silence. And there is a strange comfort in that, because if everything were already found, already named, already understood, the world would feel smaller, flatter, less alive. Mystery breathes life into the quiet corners of the mind. It softens the hard edges of a world defined by data and measurements and proofs. It returns to us a sense of wonder that often slips away. As we grow older, perhaps that is why even the failed discoveries, the Bimini Road, the terraces of Yonaguni, the strange geometric shadows caught by passing submarines, still feel precious. Each one reminds us how willing we are to hope, how ready we are to believe that there is more to this world than what can be touched or catalogued or proved. And hope, even when misguided, is not wasted. It is a light that moves quietly through the folds of the mind, illuminating possibilities we did not know we needed. It teaches us to see patterns in the ordinary, to listen for meaning beneath the noise, to step gently into the unknown without demanding certainty. In this way, Atlantis is not a destination, but a practice, a way of seeing, a way of listening, a way of remembering that the world is still capable of surprising us. Even the ocean, with its pressure and silence and endless blue, becomes less a barrier and more a companion. It holds our questions without rushing to answer them. It reflects our longing without judging its shape. It reminds us that patience is a kind of wisdom, and so the search continues, not in the frantic pace of conquest, but in the slow rhythm of curiosity, a rhythm that matches the heartbeat of the sea, steady, timeless, ancient. For the truth is simple. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be felt, meant to guide us gently toward a deeper awareness of how vast the world truly is. Atlantis may or may not be waiting in the deep, but the wonder it awakens is already here, already rising, already alive within us. There are stories that grow louder when the world tries to quiet them, stories that rise not from discovery, but from desire, the kind of desire that blooms in the places where logic softens, and the imagination begins to drift. Atlantis became one of those stories during the age of rediscovery, an age when old manuscripts resurfaced, when forgotten languages breathed again through new translations, when Europe opened its eyes after centuries of stillness and looked back toward the ancient world with both hunger and awe. It began with the return of a text, a simple manuscript carried across borders and placed into the hands of scholars who had never before encountered Plato's full voice. For generations, the story of Atlantis had lived only as fragments, echoes, trapped inside partial translations and whispered references. But now, the world finally held the complete dialogues. Timaeus and Critias, and with them, something ignited. The Renaissance was a time when humanity rediscovered itself, when the mind, long confined by walls of dogma, began to stretch again, toward the unknown. Painters searched for divine proportions. Explorers set sail toward unimagined horizons. Philosophers walked through the ruins of Greece and Rome and felt something stirring in the dust, a memory of what humankind might once have been. And into this awakening, Atlantis returned like a long-forgotten dream. For those scholars, the tale was not merely a curiosity, it was a spark, a glimpse of a world that felt impossibly ancient and impossibly advanced, as if humanity's past hid a chapter that was more glorious than its present. They saw Atlantis not as fantasy, but as a key, a doorway that opened toward questions. The Renaissance mind was finally brave enough to ask, what if civilization had risen before? What if knowledge had once reached far beyond what Europe knew? What if the past was not a straight line, but a cycle of rise and fall, forgetting and remembering? These questions bloomed quietly in the very hearts of those who were already rebuilding the world from lost fragments of antiquity. The Renaissance scholars read Plato's words and felt the pulse of something powerful, not simply history, but possibility. And possibility is a flame that needs only the smallest breath to burn. From glowing lamplight in Florence to quiet desks in Venice, Paris, and Prague, the myth began to take shape again. Writers spoke of Atlantis with cautious reverence, as if they feared awakening something too large to name. They debated whether Plato had encoded hidden truths, whether the Egyptian priests who informed Solon held records beyond imagination, whether lost continents truly lay beneath the ocean's depths. But as the world shifted again, as kingdoms expanded, as new lands were charted, as oceans opened like vast pages waiting for ink, Atlantis transformed once more. The age of exploration arrived, and suddenly the world no longer felt closed. It felt unfinished, like a book missing its final chapters. Sailors returned with tales of distant shores, so rich, so strange, so impossibly advanced in their own ways that Europe began to wonder whether the memory of Atlantis had drifted across the ocean long before any ship crossed it. When the conquistadors saw the cities of the Aztec Empire, their canals, their temples, their shimmering stone, many felt a jolt of recognition they could not explain. The floating city of Tenochtitlan glittered in the sun like a vision, pulled straight from Plato's words. Its engineering rivaled the old world. Its scale stunned all who approached. Its destruction came fast, violent, complete, and so whispers spread that perhaps Atlantis had not been swallowed by waves, but had risen again upon new shores, only to fall beneath new storms of conquest. Others looked to the Andes, to the terraces that climbed mountains, as if shaped by the hands of giants. They walked through ruins wrapped in cloud, and felt the presence of forgotten architects, who seemed to speak through the stones themselves. Every discovery, every artifact, every city, every ruin was folded into the story. Atlantis became a mirror that explorers held up to each new land, searching for reflections of their own longing. It was during this time that a new idea took root, an idea as gentle as it was expansive. What if Atlantis were not a single location? What if it were a memory carried by migrating people, a seed of civilization, passed from shore to shore, as survivors moved across the world? This thought moved through the European mind, like a quiet tide. It freed Atlantis from geography and turned it into a metaphor for origins, a place where humanity began, before scattering across the earth in waves of culture and story. By the Enlightenment, this idea grew even more subtle. The philosophers of that age, with their hunger for reason and their distaste for superstition, did not dismiss Atlantis entirely. They simply reshaped it. To them, Atlantis became a thought experiment about political decay, about technological excess, about the fragility of even the greatest societies. It became a reflection of what Europe feared it might become, a civilization too proud, too confident, too blind to its own vulnerabilities. Atlantis shifted again, from geography to symbolism, from legend to lesson, and yet, beneath this intellectual polishing, the softer emotional truth remained. People still felt drawn to the idea that somewhere in humanity's deep memory there had been a golden age, a world of clarity, balance, and brilliance that we have spent centuries trying to reclaim. This longing seeped into literature. Poets spoke of lost islands, with voices trembling between wonder and grief. Novelists crafted worlds of ancient wisdom, hidden beneath modern ignorance. Travelers returned from distant seas, with journals filled not only with facts, but with quiet hopes that the next horizon might reveal a fragment of the world Plato described. And then came the Romantics, a generation that lived with emotion as its compass. They embraced Atlantis, not as a place, but as a feeling, the feeling of yearning for something beautiful and unreachable, a memory that might not be real, but still feels true. To them, Atlantis symbolized the highest form of nostalgia, not for childhood, not for simpler times, but for an age that predates all ages, an innocence so ancient it lives beneath the threshold of imagination. And in that shift, Atlantis became something new again, no longer a puzzle waiting to be solved, but a longing waiting to be felt. Each era reimagined Atlantis in its own image, shaping the lost island, according to its fears, its hopes, its questions. And yet, through all these transformations, one thing remained constant: Atlantis survived. It survived not because evidence proved it, but because humanity needed it. It became a vessel that could hold whatever the age required: hope, warning, wonder, nostalgia, identity, possibility, a vessel always large enough to contain the deepest human emotions, and always empty enough to allow new ones to flow in. This is the true endurance of the myth, not its ruins, not its geography, not its fate, but its ability to shift shape without ever fading, to adapt to the needs of each new century, while keeping its core untouched. That soft, glowing center of mystery and promise. Atlantis lives because humanity keeps returning to it, as if it were a shoreline in the mind, a place we remember, even if we do not know how. And as we move now into the next layers of this journey, that shoreline remains before us, quiet, still, waiting to be approached again. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. For the deeper the world wandered into the modern age, the more Atlantis seemed to shift its shape, to match the shifting shape of humanity itself. It was no longer merely a tale told by philosophers, or a curiosity murmured in scholarly halls. It had become a quiet undercurrent, moving through the collective imagination, a reminder that some part of us still listens for ancient rhythms. The world has forgotten how to hear. By the late 19th century, as new sciences rose and old certainties began to tremble, Atlantis found yet another form. People who once turned solely to scripture or empire now turned inward, toward dreams, symbols, archetypes, and Atlantis drifted with them, suspended in that soft space, between inner knowing and outer doubt. Writers no longer asked, "Where was Atlantis?" They asked, "What does Atlantis mean?" And this quiet shift changed everything. It meant the island could be everywhere and nowhere. It could belong to maps or to memory. It could rest beneath an ocean or within the mind. It could be a story of destruction or a story of awakening. It could be the echo of a real civilization or a metaphor for the one humankind still hopes to build. Atlantis did not resist this transformation. It welcomed it, as if the myth itself understood that survival requires softness, that endurance lives not in rigidity, but in the ability to bend without breaking. And so Atlantis moved again, quietly, gently, inevitably, into the dreams of the 20th century, a century that would invent machines Plato could never imagine, a century that would witness destruction on a scale he could never comprehend, a century that would make the myth feel both prophetic and painfully familiar. For as the world split itself open, with wars and discoveries, with knowledge expanding faster than wisdom could contain, the tale of a brilliant civilization, lost to its own excess, no longer felt ancient. It felt close. It felt intimate. It felt like a warning, whispered across time, soft but unignorable. And that is why, even as the modern age pressed forward, with satellites and submarines, with theories and technologies, Atlantis never retreated into the past. It followed us. It evolved with us. It became a companion to our uncertainty and a mirror for our deepest desires. Because in every era, Atlantis offers the same quiet question, a question the world has never been able to answer and has never been able to forget. What if we are remembering something we have forgotten how to remember? And with that question, settling softly into the mind, we are ready to go deeper still. There is a moment in every long-lived myth when it slips free of the scholars and begins to belong to the dreamers. a moment when the boundaries of history grow thin enough for imagination to step quietly through, carrying with it questions that logic cannot hold and wonder cannot ignore. For Atlantis, that moment arrived in the 20th century, not through archaeology, not through philosophy, but through a quiet revolution of spirit, a turning inward, a longing for meaning, in a world growing louder, faster, and more uncertain with every passing decade. It began softly, in circles of people, who gathered not in temples or libraries, but in small living rooms, in quiet forests, in dimly lit rooms scented with incense and possibility. They were searching for something that modern life could not offer, a sense of connection to something older, something wiser, something that spoke not just to the mind, but to the soul. And into this gentle hunger, Atlantis returned again, not as a city, not as a ruin, but as a memory wrapped in light. For the new age was dawning, and with it came a movement that believed knowledge could be felt as much as learned. People spoke of vibrations, energies, hidden senses awakening. They believed the earth itself was alive with consciousness, and that humanity had only begun to rediscover the abilities it had once possessed. Atlantis became central to that belief, a symbol not of loss, but of potential. Suddenly the island was envisioned, not as stone and metal, but as crystal and spirit, a civilization powered by harmonies, rather than engines, by resonance rather than force. A place where intuition was not a whisper, but a language, where thought could shape matter, where consciousness could move freely, like water through the world. It was during this era that the idea of Atlantean technology took shape, not machines of gears and smoke, but structures carved from energies that pulsed like currents of the earth. Some said the Atlanteans understood crystal matrices, capable of storing knowledge, the way modern devices store electricity. Others claimed their temples were built on ley lines, channels of planetary energy, that allowed them to heal, to communicate, to lift objects with the mind's quiet strength. These ideas did not emerge from evidence. They emerged from yearning, a yearning to believe that humanity was once more than it is now and could be more again. And beneath those yearnings lay something softer, a longing to feel at home in a universe that suddenly felt too large and too mechanical to hold meaning. It was during this time that channelers appeared, men and women who claimed to hear voices not of this age, not of this world, but of another time entirely. Some said they spoke with Atlantean elders, beings who had transcended physical form and now reached across the veil to guide humanity back toward the light. Others believed they were remembering past lives, not through logic, but through the subtle movements of the soul. Their words flowed like soft currents. Atlantis had risen in purity and fallen in imbalance. It had flourished in harmony and been undone by misuse of knowledge. It had not simply disappeared. It had transformed, ascending to a higher plane, while the earth descended into a long sleep. These stories were not history. They were a balm, a way for people to understand their own wounds through the metaphor of a fallen world that once held immense beauty. But Atlantis did not remain alone. It soon found itself paired with another lost realm, Lemuria. While Atlantis represented intellect and power, Lemuria became the symbol of tenderness, intuition, gentle spirit. Together, they formed a dual mythology, one grounded in the sea, the other drifting across the Pacific like a forgotten dream. People spoke of Lemurians as beings of profound peace, creatures of light, who lived in harmony with the natural world. Some said they had once shared the earth with Atlanteans, two great civilizations, balancing one another, like breath and heartbeat. And as these myths intertwined, they created a new vision, a vision of an ancient earth, alive with knowledge so vast, so luminous, that its echo still vibrates beneath the surface of the human mind. To modern thinkers, these ideas seemed strange, even outrageous. But to those who carried them, they were not simply fantasies. They were explanations, ways to articulate feelings that logic could not hold, because beneath the crystals, beneath the channeling, beneath the shimmering imagery of beings made of light, lay a deeper truth. People were grieving the loss of connection to nature, to wonder, to silence, grieving the rise of a world filled with machines, but empty of meaning, grieving the sense that humanity was forgetting something essential, something ancient, something woven into its very being. Atlantis became the symbol of that forgotten memory, a reminder that perhaps the human spirit was not broken, only sleeping. And so the myths grew richer, expanding into stories of star visitors who guided ancient civilizations, of cosmic teachers who planted seeds of wisdom before returning to the heavens. People imagined Atlanteans not as mortals, but as hybrid beings, part earth, part sky. These ideas were not meant to rewrite history. They were meant to soothe the longing for belonging, to remind humanity that it might not be alone in the vast dark of existence. And there is a certain tenderness in that longing, a softness that moves beneath all the fantastical imagery, because the New Age interpretations of Atlantis were ultimately expressions of hope. Hope that intelligence could evolve without cruelty, that power could exist without domination, that societies could rise without devouring themselves. In this sense, the New Age version of Atlantis was not a replacement for Plato's tale. It was a reinterpretation of what humanity wishes it could become. But something else lived beneath these stories too, something quiet and easily overlooked. It was the recognition that myths adapt because people adapt, that every generation reshapes the ancient stories in ways that reflect their deepest questions. For the 20th century, those questions were vast. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why do we remember things we have never seen? Why do we dream of a past that feels more advanced than our present? Each speculation, each mystical vision, each fragile theory was a way of reaching toward answers that science could not yet touch. And in that reaching, Atlantis became a mirror again, not of geography, not of archaeology, but of the human psyche, stretching toward the unseen. Some dismissed these stories as wishful thinking, but wishful thinking is still thinking, and longing is still a kind of truth, because in the end, the New Age version of Atlantis was not concerned with proving anything. It was concerned with healing the fracture between humanity and nature, healing the loneliness of a world divided by borders and noise, healing the wound of forgetting who we once imagined ourselves to be. And perhaps that is why these ideas continue to persist, not because they offer certainty, but because they offer gentleness, a gentleness that whispers that humanity is more ancient than its timelines, more mysterious than its textbooks, more luminous than its machines, a gentleness that suggests we are not simply evolving forward, but remembering backward, retracing steps once taken in an age that exists, somewhere between memory and myth. And with that understanding, the story of Atlantis moves again into new shapes, new meanings, new depths waiting quietly for those who are ready to listen. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. And perhaps that is the quiet secret hidden beneath all these visions, that Atlantis, in the New Age mind, was never meant to be a destination in time, but a destination in consciousness, a place not found by travelling outward, but by moving gently inward through the soft corridors of intuition, where forgotten feelings glow, like embers waiting to be stirred. For as the century unfolded, the conversation around Atlantis shifted again, growing less about grand civilizations and more about the inner landscape of the human heart. People began to wonder whether Atlantis was not a memory of stone, but a memory of the soul, a symbol of an inner world we once inhabited before the noise of modern life scattered us away from ourselves. Meditation circles spoke of Atlantean wisdom as something not lost, but hidden, buried beneath layers of distraction and fear, and the relentless pace of a world that had forgotten how to be still. Healers use the word Atlantis not to describe a place, but a state of being, a gentleness, a clarity, a trust in the quiet movements of intuition. They said the Atlantean heart was not defined by power, but by attunement, a tuning of the self to the subtle harmonies that thread through all life, and slowly the myth became less an ancient echo and more a living invitation. It invited people to imagine that beneath the layers of survival, beneath the armor built by centuries of fear and forgetting, there remained a softness capable of knowing without seeing, of understanding without proof, of sensing the delicate presence, of meaning woven into every moment. Atlantis became the metaphor for that softness, the untouched part of the human spirit that still remembers how to feel the world. Instead of conquering it, some began to say that Atlantis would rise again, not from the sea, but from within, in the form of a new consciousness, a quieter way of living, a return to harmony that the modern age had misplaced. And whether or not these visions held any historical truth did not seem to matter. Their emotional truth was undeniable, because deep down, people longed for a world that moved gently, a world that valued balance over accumulation, connection over domination, presence over speed. Atlantis, in its New Age form, became the symbol of that longing, a whispered reminder that humanity's greatest potential may not lie in what it builds, but in what it remembers. There comes a time in every legend when it must pass through the hands of science, not to be proven or disproven, but to be reshaped by the quiet weight of knowledge and the vast patience of the earth itself. For Atlantis, that time arrived in the modern era when humanity began to study the planet, not as a map, but as a memory held in stone, in ice, in the drifting sediments of ancient seas. And as the earth began to speak through these new languages, the myth of Atlantis did not fade. It changed, it softened, it deepened, becoming something quieter, something less literal, and somehow more profound. It began with geology, with scientists kneeling over layers of rock, like scribes reading the pages of a forgotten book. They saw how continents moved, slowly, deliberately, like giants turning in their sleep. They discovered that the earth was not fixed but fluid, its surface shifting across millions of years, like drifting islands of memory. Plate tectonics rewrote the story of the world. It told us that continents do not simply disappear in a single night, that vast land masses do not sink, like ships swallowed by the sea, and for a moment it seemed as if the dream of Atlantis must finally be set aside. But the earth, in its endless complexity, never gives answers so easily. For even as geology closed one door, it opened another, a door not into lost continents, but into lost coastlines. Scientists learned that sea levels had once been far lower, that during the last ice age, vast regions of the world lay exposed beneath the sun. Entire landscapes, forests, plains, river valleys, now sleep beneath the ocean, hidden beneath layers of turquoise water and drifting light. And suddenly, the idea of a world erased by rising seas no longer felt like myth. It felt like history. There was Doggerland, the sprawling land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, a world of hunters and rivers, and ancient life, now resting beneath the North Sea. There was the Sunda Shelf, where Indonesia spreads today, across what was once a vast and continuous continent. There was Beringia, the land bridge that carried people between Asia and the Americas, before sinking beneath the waves. These were real places, real worlds, real lives, all vanished beneath rising waters. As the Ice Age melted and the oceans rose with slow, inevitable force. And in the soft glow of this truth, Atlantis felt less like an impossibility and more like a symbol for every world the ocean has ever taken, Then came the study of ancient floods, floods so massive they reshaped continents, floods so sudden they rewrote the memory of whole civilizations. Geologists found evidence of the Black Sea deluge, a time when rising waters burst through the Bosporus and drowned a vast freshwater plain beneath a wave unstoppable and immense. Others traced the meltwater pulses that surged from collapsing glaciers, like breaths escaping the lungs of a dying age. Science was not proving Atlantis, but it was proving that the world has known destruction on a scale that ancient memory could not forget. Paleoclimatologists studied cores of ice, drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, each layer a thin horizon of time, a frozen record of atmospheres and storms, and shifts in the planet's breath. And in those layers, they saw a world much less stable than the one humanity lives in now. A world of rapid changes, of sudden freezes, and sudden thaws, a world in which entire coastlines could vanish within the span of a few generations. Such a world does not erase its trauma easily, and myths, after all, are simply the echoes of what the earth remembers. When human voices are not loud enough to speak on their own, geneticists added another thread to the tapestry. They traced the migrations of ancient peoples through the quiet signatures written in DNA. They found surprises, migrations far older than once believed, roots that defied old assumptions, connections that hinted at civilizations rising and falling long before recorded history began. The past grew older, more intricate, more layered. With each discovery, it no longer seemed impossible that a sophisticated society might have risen in the deep past, not as advanced as Plato described, but advanced enough to leave a wound in memory when it vanished, and that wound might have healed into a myth. As anthropology evolved, scholars realized that oral traditions could preserve memories for thousands of years. Stories of floods found in cultures across the world began to seem less like coincidence and more like shared recollections of global trauma. Atlantean scholars, the careful ones, the ones who sought not proof, but understanding, began to see the myth, not as a literal account, but as a symbolic one, a memory of a world shattered by water, when the ice melted and the oceans rose. And in that interpretation, Atlantis became not a lost continent, but a lost chapter in humanity's story, a chapter written in the language of survival and grief and awe. Even oceanographers, mapping the seafloor with sonar and satellites, found landscapes that looked eerily like drowned worlds, submerged river valleys, ancient mountain ranges, plateaus that once touched the sky and now lie beneath miles of water. None were Atlantis, and yet all were Atlantis, each one a reminder that the ocean has swallowed more history than the land has ever recorded. The more science learned, the more the myth transformed. Atlantis was no longer a question of whether the story was true, but what the story was trying to remember. Was it recalling a real place? Was it mourning a world destroyed? Was it warning the future with the memory of the past? Or was it simply expressing something deep and universal in the human soul? The knowledge that everything beautiful is fragile? Even the concept of catastrophism, once dismissed, as superstition began to return through the language of modern science. Scientists found evidence of asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, global collapses that reshaped life in the blink of geological time. Suddenly, the idea of a civilization destroyed in a night did not seem as outlandish as it once had. But science did not confirm Atlantis. It did something gentler. It made room for it, room for the possibility that myths are not mistakes, but memories refracted through centuries of fear and wonder, room for the understanding that truth does not always survive in the form we expect, that stories may hold the residue of real events, even when their details blur into symbol and poetry room for the recognition that the human mind, just like the earth, contains hidden layers, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps that is why Atlantis survives so effortlessly in the modern imagination, not because science confirms it, but because science, in its quiet precision, reveals a world far stranger, far more dramatic, far more unpredictable than the myths ever dared to claim. The earth itself is a keeper of lost worlds, and Atlantis, whether real or metaphor, is simply the name we give to one of them. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. And yet, even with all this knowledge laid before us, something in the story remains unresolved. A quiet presence, just beyond the edge of certainty, like a silhouette glimpsed through mist. For every discovery that narrows the possibilities, another opens them wider. The earth is not a simple storyteller. It is vast, layered, and ancient beyond comprehension. And every time we peel back one veil, we find another beneath it, darker, deeper, older. Marine archaeologists began to study places that had been unreachable before. Continental shelves drowned beneath 100 meters of water, ancient river deltas now buried under sediment, caves whose entrances lie far below the modern surface of the sea. And within these submerged worlds, human traces appeared. Stone tools, animal bones marked by blades, footprints sealed in mineral silence, nothing large, nothing that could claim the name Atlantis. But each discovery whispered the same question. How much lies hidden in the world we can no longer touch? There are ruins in the Mediterranean that once stood on dry ground, but now sway gently in blue water. There are drowned forests off the coast of Wales, where tree stumps still stand, like blackened teeth of a vanished world. There are sunken stone circles near Orkney, buried temples in Malta, collapsed settlements off the coast of India, sealed beneath layers of silt, older than recorded history. None of these are Atlantis, but together they form a chorus that softens the boundary between legend and possibility. Because what science reveals, quietly, patiently, is not that Atlantis never existed, but that history is far less complete than we once believed. That memory is fragile, that coastlines are temporary, that the ocean does not simply erase what it takes, it transforms it, and perhaps that is the soft truth. Beneath all the arguments, all the theories, all the years spent searching for one lost island, in an ocean of lost worlds, maybe Atlantis was never meant to be a single place. Maybe it is the collective memory of every civilization that stood too close to the edge of nature's shifting breath, every city that rose in brilliance only to be undone by forces larger than human intention, every world that vanished before anyone could write its name. In that sense, Atlantis is not just a question about the past, it is a mirror for the future, a reminder that nothing built by human hands is beyond the reach of the earth, or time, or the quiet turning of ages. And in that reminder, the myth becomes gentler, deeper, more human. It becomes a way to hold the fragility of existence without fear, a way to understand that loss is not the end of meaning, but part of the story the planet tells as it moves through its endless cycles of creation and change. And perhaps that is why the legend endures, because beneath the mystery there is truth, and beneath the truth there is wonder. There are moments in human history when science does not roar, does not correct, does not attempt to tear down a myth, brick by brick, but instead steps forward softly with a kind of quiet compassion, as if understanding that some stories are too deeply woven into the human spirit to be confronted with force. And so when the legend of Atlantis rose toward the surface once more, shining with all the colours of longing and imagination, science did not strike it down. It simply placed a gentle hand on humanity's shoulder and whispered, almost apologetically, "We have looked, we have listened, and the ocean is silent." It began with the ocean floor, that vast, breathing, restless skin of the earth that holds more secrets than any library humanity has ever built. For centuries, People believed that civilizations might sleep beneath it, preserved like insects in amber, waiting for the right moment to return to the world of air. But when the tools finally arrived, sonar maps, seismic readings, submersibles capable of diving into the quiet, crushing dark, the ocean revealed something most did not expect. Not ruins, not domes, not walls shaped by hands that vanished 10,000 years ago. Only stone, water, darkness, an emptiness so profound that it almost felt intentional. Oceanographers traced the mid-Atlantic ridge, that long spine of volcanic birth, where the earth slowly opens and creates new crust from fire. If a continent had shattered here, if a vast landmass had collapsed, in a single night, as Plato described, the earth would have carried the scar, like a memory etched into bone. But there was nothing, no sudden drop, no broken shelf, no great wound in the crust, only the slow, patient movement of tectonic plates, that shift with rhythms older than life itself. The Atlantic, scientists explained, is young by geological standards, so young that a continent sinking into it 12,000 years ago would be like claiming the moon. Fell out of the sky last winter. The numbers did not bend. The layers of sediment did not lie. The stone told its story plainly, without malice, without triumph. It simply said, the ocean has always been ocean here. Some felt disappointment, others felt relief, but most felt something quieter, a kind of stillness, in which possibility did not disappear, only changed its shape, because the absence of a continent did not erase the longing that gave Atlantis life. It merely asked the mind to dream differently. The places once whispered about, with trembling excitement, Bimini Road, the terraces of Yonaguni, the strange shapes near the Azores, each submitted to the soft scrutiny of science, like shy children offering their hands. What appeared to be cut stone became fractured limestone. What looked like steps became natural bedding planes. What seemed to form avenues became currents sculpting sand into illusions that mimicked intention, not fakes, not hoaxes, simply nature expressing itself in ways that happened to resemble the architecture of memory. And this, in a way, was even more beautiful than proof, because it showed how the human mind is drawn to patterns, to echoes, to the possibility that something sleeps beneath the surface, waiting to be found. Archaeologists searching the shallows found less than they hoped for and more than they expected. Not empires, but hearths. Not palaces, but small houses of stone. Not crystal machinery, but tools worn smooth by hands long returned to dust. These discoveries did not tell the story of an advanced civilization that mastered impossible technologies. They told the story of people who lived with simplicity and strength, who fished the ancient coasts, who walked the shores before the sea rose up to swallow their world. They were not Atlanteans, but they were human, and in their remnants lived a tenderness that the myth had always contained beneath its grandness. Scientists did not laugh at Atlantis. They did not mock the dream. Instead, they knelt beside the drowned valleys, the submerged forests, the ancient rivers now flowing beneath salt water, and they said softly, "We have found other worlds that sank beneath the sea, but none match the island you seek, because the truth was simple. The earth remembers everything, and in the last 12,000 years, nothing as vast as a continent has disappeared beneath the waves, without leaving behind the faintest trace." But the silence was not an ending. It was an opening. For every answer science offered created a new space in which the imagination could drift more freely. If there was no continent, then perhaps Atlantis was something smaller, something closer to the shore, something erased not by catastrophe, but by time. Science did not say Atlantis was impossible. It simply said that if it existed, it must have been something else, something the world has not yet learned how to name, because beneath all the data, beneath all the measurements, there was still the vastness of the ocean, a vastness so deep that even today, humanity has explored less than 10% of it. There are trenches no sunlight has touched. Since the world was young, there are plains that shift with currents, as soft as breathing. There are caverns beneath underwater mountains, where no machine has yet descended, no camera has captured the shape of darkness. And somewhere within that unmapped silence, Atlantis continues to shimmer, like a distant lantern, glowing beneath endless waves. Scientists, with all their instruments, with all their precision, with all their devotion to truth, can only offer one conclusion, one wrapped in humility, rather than certainty. We have no evidence. Not, there is nothing. Not, it never was. Not, it cannot be. Just the soft honesty of not knowing, and in that gentle gap between what has been found and what remains hidden, the myth endures, not because it defies science, but because science has not yet touched the whole of the world, nor the whole of the human heart. For the ocean is not merely a body of water, it is a memory, a vault of lost landscapes, a keeper of stories that the earth has chosen not to speak of yet, and the silence that science hears when it listens to the deep is not empty. It is full, full of worlds that once were, full of whispers waiting to rise, full of echoes from civilizations so fragile that the sea carried them away before history learned how to write. Atlantis lives in that silence, not as a continent, not as an empire, but as a question, one so ancient, so gentle, and so persistent, that no amount of data has ever been able to quiet it, because humans do not dream only of what is real. They dream of what is missing, what is felt, what is remembered without memory. And perhaps that is why the myth still breathes, not in defiance of science, but in harmony with it, because both seek the same thing, to understand the world, to uncover what lies hidden, to listen to the silence beneath the surface. And somewhere in that silence, Atlantis waits, not to be proven, but to be understood. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. And so the search continued, not in defiance of science, but in companionship with it, each discipline holding a fragment of the truth, each discovery widening the horizon, rather than closing it. For the deeper researchers looked into the planet's past, the more they realized how much of human history had unfolded on coastlines now drowned, how many settlements hugged the edges of ancient seas before the waters rose, like a slow inhalation of the world. With every sonar scan, with every sediment core, with every drowned structure uncovered piece by piece, the same realization returned, that the earth had always been capable of erasing the fragile footprints of entire peoples, without erasing their presence from the human soul. And perhaps that is why the myth of Atlantis persists, not as a stubborn fantasy, but as an instinct, a quiet awareness that something has been lost. Not once, but many times, geologists studying ancient shorelines found evidence of tsunami scars, stretching for miles, vast walls of water that reshaped continents in a single afternoon. Volcanologists uncovered clues of eruptions so violent they turned day into night across half the world. Anthropologists mapped traces of migrations that seemed to begin after some great upheaval, as if entire tribes had fled a world collapsing around them. These were not Atlantis, but they were worlds that vanished quickly enough to leave only stories behind. And stories, as the earth has taught again and again, are often the last survivors of whatever catastrophe the land could not endure. It is in this intersection where evidence ends and memory begins that Atlantis continues to breathe, not as a perfect circle of canals, not as a gleaming temple of metal and light, but as the symbol of every human fear that the world can change too quickly, and every human hope that something precious can still be carried forward. Science cannot map longing. It cannot measure the shape of wonder. It cannot record the tremble. that moves through the human heart when it senses that the past is larger than the present can explain. But science can remind us that the earth is stranger than any story, that its silences are not empty, but waiting, that its depths are not barren, but unspoken. And within that vast waiting darkness, Atlantis lingers. Not a city, not a continent, but a whisper of everything humanity fears losing and everything it hopes to find again. A reminder that even if the ocean is silent, the silence itself is alive. There are stories that refuse to stay inside the pages where they were born, stories that slip quietly from ancient hands into new voices, new mediums, new minds, that have never touched the sand of Athens or smelled the salt of the Mediterranean, but somehow remember the feeling of a city that may have never existed at all. Atlantis is one of those stories. It did not fade when scholars disagreed. It did not crumble when archaeologists found nothing. It simply changed its shape, as water changes shape when poured from one vessel into another. It left the seriousness of Plato's dialogues, slid past the debates of philosophers, and entered a new kind of life, a life woven from ink and imagination, from cinema and sound, from pixels and painted panels, from voices speaking softly in the dark. To listeners who did not want facts as much as they wanted wonder, Atlantis became a story that belonged not to the ancient world, but to the shared dreamscape of modern humanity. It began quietly with Jules Verne, a man who understood before most that the world beneath the ocean was the perfect canvas for mysteries too soft and fragile to survive on land. In the dim light of his study, he gave Atlantis a body not made of stone, but made of mood. Pillars leaning under the weight of time, statues watching the drifting currents, corridors where only the echo of water could recall the feet that once walked there. It was Verne who taught an entire generation that Atlantis did not need to be proven, to be felt. As decades passed, the myth swelled like a tide, moving toward the shores of popular imagination. Writers of pulp fiction, armed with nothing more than cheap paper and boundless enthusiasm, reshaped the lost island into a playground of pure possibility. Here, Atlantis shimmered with crystal machines that hummed like living creatures. Here, its citizens possessed strength beyond strength and wisdom beyond wisdom. Here, forgotten bloodlines hid beneath jungles, beneath ice, beneath the shifting floor of the sea. These stories did not last on shelves. They did not need to. They lasted in feeling, a bright, impossible feeling, that maybe, just maybe, the world once held wonders greater than anything alive today. Then came the Silver Age of comics, and Atlantis found a new kingdom. Aquaman, half human and half myth, rose from the water, with the weight of a drowned empire on his shoulders. Namor, fierce and conflicted, ruled an Atlantis, whose storms mirrored his own heart. These Atlanteans were not Plato's descendants, but something entirely modern. They were metaphors for isolation, power, identity, and the quiet ache of belonging to two worlds at once. Their cities glittered in ink, full of towers rising from coral, full of palaces sculpted from light, full of symbols that spoke, not of archaeology, but of desire. Atlantis had become an idea that anyone could rewrite. Then the flood of cinema arrived, and with it, a new world of light and movement. Atlantis appeared in silent films, in black and white visions that flickered like dreams on fragile reels. But it was not until Disney placed its gentle hand on the myth that Atlantis experienced one of its most tender rebirths. Atlantis, the lost empire, did not try to mimic Plato. It did not try to explain the past. Instead, it imagined what Atlantis could have meant if it had been shaped by a child's sense of awe. Soft blue light, floating crystals, a language crafted from nothing but possibility. Disney gave the lost city a pulse, a rhythm, a warmth, as if the myth were not a ruin, but a living heart that had been waiting for someone to listen. And people listened. They entered the city through screens through soundtracks, through whispered lines of dialogue that lingered long after the film ended. They carried Atlantis with them, the way one carries a half-remembered dream. But the dream was not finished. As technology advanced, Atlantis stepped gracefully into the world of video games, a world not of watching, but of wandering. Players descended into caverns, where the ocean glowed like a sleeping star. They brushed their hands against broken archways, as if the pixels were real stone. They uncovered artifacts that no history book had ever recorded, but that still felt like they held the weight of centuries. In these digital realms, Atlantis could be anywhere, beneath Antarctic ice, at the edge of the Mariana Trench, inside a pocket dimension, where time wandered in circles. It no longer mattered whether the myth matched geography. It only mattered whether it matched emotion. And so, Atlantis moved between dimensions of storytelling, never fixed, never limited, always growing, always becoming. Finally, the lost city drifted into the modern tide of documentaries, mockumentaries, and late-night explorations of what might be true. Behind the thin veil of the unknown, here, narrators spoke in low tones, as if afraid to disturb whatever slept beneath the waves. Computer-generated ruins rose from the deep with soft, ghost-like beauty. Theories unfolded, not to convince, but to soothe, as if the story itself were a lullaby for the mind. And on YouTube, the myth found its newest home. Creators told the story in voices almost whispering, letting the rhythm of the tale soften the edges of the world for listeners lying in their beds with their eyes half closed. Atlantis became a companion for sleepless nights, a gentle tide, pulling the mind toward rest. It did not matter whether the story was true. It mattered that it felt true, in a way that science could neither confirm nor erase. Because when a myth survives long enough, it stops being a place. It becomes a feeling that the world holds more than what is visible, a feeling that ancient wisdom is never entirely lost, a feeling that beauty, even if drowned, finds a way to rise again. In the imagination, Atlantis now lives, in novels and films, in comics and games, in quiet murmured stories, woven through the night. It belongs to no author, to no era, to no single vision. It belongs to everyone who has ever closed their eyes and felt that there is something just beyond the horizon, something gentle, something ancient, something forgotten that still remembers us. And perhaps that is why Atlantis continues to return, again and again, in new forms, with new faces, under new lights. Not because humanity believes in a lost continent, but because humanity believes in the possibility of wonder, a wonder that survives. Every scientific correction, every skeptical question, every boundary of logic, a wonder that drifts, like a soft current, through the human soul, quiet, persistent, and impossibly alive. And that is why, in the modern world, Atlantis is not simply remembered, it is lived. If you're ready, we can continue deeper. And yet, even as Atlantis drifted into every corner of modern culture, something subtle began to happen, something quieter than film reels, and softer than turning pages. The myth started to breathe, through the spaces between stories, through the unspoken places, where imagination rests before it becomes language. It began appearing in music, not as lyrics, but as atmosphere, in low, trembling notes that sounded like distant currents, in choral echoes that felt like voices rising from a cathedral beneath the sea. Musicians chased the feeling of Atlantis without ever naming it, following its tone, its calm, its haunted luminosity. Painters followed too, canvases filled with blue light and ghost-like silhouettes, vistas where ruins seemed to float, inside dreamlike oceans that defied physics, but obeyed emotion. These paintings were not depictions, they were memories, borrowed from an imagination that did not need truth to recognize beauty. Architecture borrowed from the myth as well. Curved domes, spiraling towers, glass that caught the light, as if it had been shaped by water, not heat. Buildings rose in coastal cities that seemed to hint at submerged kingdoms, just beyond the horizon, as if reminding passers-by that the line between land and sea has always been temporary. Even fashion touched the myth. Iridescent fabrics that shimmered like scales, pearlescent jewelry that looked as though it had been dredged from forgotten depths, designs that felt ancient and futuristic. At the same time, Atlantis wove itself into dresses, into runways, into the quiet way light catches silver and makes it glow like something alive. And then, in the quietest spaces of all, the myth entered meditation halls, yoga, estudios, rooms lit only by candles, and the soft hum of breath. People whispered about Atlantis, not as a place, but as a frequency, a gentler way of being, a memory of harmony, a symbol of what humanity might reclaim, if it learned once again to listen. Some said the myth survived because it held a promise. The modern world had forgotten how to make the promise that wisdom and beauty could coexist without being consumed by ambition. Others said it survived because it remembered something. Humans have always suspected that beneath the surface of the world we know lies a world we have lost, and beneath the surface of the world we lost lies a world we still long for. But perhaps the simplest truth is that Atlantis endures because humans love the shape of yearning, the soft pull of something just out of reach, the gentle ache of imagining. A civilization that lived not in conflict, but in balance, not in noise, but in depth. And so Atlantis travels from mind to mind, from century to century, taking on whatever shape each generation needs most. A mystery, a warning, a hope, a lullaby. And as the world grows louder, faster, more tangled, the myth grows softer, slower, more essential, like a hand resting quietly on the heartbeat of the human story, reminding everyone who listens that somewhere beyond the edges of certainty, there is still room for wonder. There are stories that move not like lightning but like tides, slow, steady, and impossible to stop. Stories that begin in one corner of the ancient world and somehow find their way into the pulse of every culture they touch. Stories that flow quietly across borders, the way moonlight slides across the surface of water, softly, without effort, without sound. Atlantis became such a story. It drifted from Plato's dialogues into the hands of scholars, then into the dreams of artists, then into the restless curiosity of a modern world searching for meaning in places that the eye cannot reach. And as the centuries turned, the myth did something rare. It detached itself from the soil of its origin and became a global current, not shouted, not forced, just gently carried by the minds of people who found in its silence a reflection of something they could not name. In Asia, in Europe, in the Americas, Atlantis transformed, adapting its shape to the landscapes of emotion and memory. Unique to each culture, it became not a single story, but a constellation of stories, each one holding a different color, of the same ancient light. In Japan, the myth took on the softness of longing. Anime and manga depicted Atlantis not as a fortress of stone, but as a spiritual echo, a place where wisdom lived, not in machines, but in silence. Artists portrayed it as a realm suspended in time, accessible only through intuition, through dreams, through the gentle ache of remembering something that the conscious mind has never seen. These Japanese retellings rarely focused on power or conquest. They focused on hearts, on fragile emotions, on the quiet grief of losing a world that once understood the language of balance. Atlantis became a metaphor for the knowledge that slips through fingers, for the tenderness that vanishes too quickly, for the yearning to reconnect with something pure and ancient. that modern life has forgotten. In Europe, the myth moved differently. It became a puzzle, a question placed carefully on a table, where historians and archaeologists leaned over with steady hands and furrowed brows. European storytelling treated Atlantis as a challenge. Could this place have existed? Where are its ruins? What does Plato's timeline mean? What does the geology say? The oceanography? The archaeology? Yet beneath all the structure, beneath the maps and charts, and seismic readings, there was always a thin thread of wonder, a softness in the voice of every narrator, who spoke about the possibility that something extraordinary once touched the earth and vanished into the water before history began to write. Europe did not want to believe blindly, but it did not want to let go either. This subtle tension gave their documentaries and their quiet academic debates a strangely emotional tone, a tone that whispered, in spite of all the evidence, that the human spirit is most alive when it stands at the edge of the unknown. In America, Atlantis became a mirror, a symbol of adventure, of rediscovery, of personal transformation. Hollywood turned it into a journey inward, a quest not just to find a lost place, but to find some hidden part of the self. The Lost City became a threshold story, a story where characters descended into the deep only to surface, carrying a new version of who they could be. In these American retellings, Atlantis glowed with themes of identity, courage, and the fragile space between what we know and what we fear. It became the stage for explorers and seekers, for inventions and secrets, for revelations that altered the way characters viewed the world, not because Atlantis changed them, but because it reminded them of the vastness inside themselves. The beauty of this cultural unfolding was its diversity, the same myth, just one story, fractured into hundreds of interpretations, each one shaped by the needs of the culture that held it. Japan held on to its spirit. Europe held on to its memory. America held on to its possibility. Just as a crystal refracts a single beam of light into many colors, Atlantis split into narrative spectrums that stretched across continents and into minds that needed it for different reasons. In some cultures, the myth became a sanctuary, a soft place to rest, when reality grew too rigid. In others, it became a caution, a reminder that civilizations can collapse when they forget how to listen to the world that sustains them. In still others, it became a whisper of hope, the idea that even if something beautiful and wise is lost, its memory continues to ripple outward, long after the city itself has turned to sand. Even the descriptions of Atlantis changed. In the West, its architecture grew grand, massive rings of stone, towers that pierced the sky, machines of unknown design. In the East, its architecture softened, temples built of light, gardens that flowed like water, cities that seemed made from the breath of ancient forests. These differences did not contradict each other. They complemented one another, revealing a truth deeper than the myth itself. Atlantis was never just a place. It was a feeling each culture translated through its own language of the heart. As globalization washed the world into a single, interconnected rhythm, Atlantis became even more fluid. It moved from myth to motif, to metaphor. It appeared in fashion, in ambient music, in architecture, in meditation apps, in the soft, echoing videos that accompany people as they fall asleep. Atlantis evolved into a symbol of inner peace, a submerged world that listeners drift toward as they close their eyes, guided by the slow cadence of a storyteller's voice. And somewhere along this journey, the myth found its true home, not in any one culture, not in any one belief, not in any single retelling, but in the collective subconscious of the human species. It became a shared memory of a world we may have never lived in, yet somehow miss. A world where wisdom and wonder existed side by side, where beauty was not ornamental, but essential, where the rise and fall of civilizations were understood as cycles of learning rather than catastrophes of fate. As Atlantis spread across continents and across generations, its meaning expanded until it touched something universal, a longing every culture shares, but rarely speaks aloud, the longing to reconnect with a past that feels purer than the present, the longing to believe that humanity once walked in balance with the natural world, the longing to feel that we are part of something older and larger than the brief, fragile span of our individual lives. This is why the myth continues to grow, not because it is true, not because it is false, but because it resonates with the quiet place inside every person that searches for belonging. And in that sense, Atlantis carries the gentlest message any myth has ever offered. The world is bigger than what we see. The past is deeper than what we remember. And somewhere between the waves and the dreams we do not speak, there is a place, not on any map, but inside the human heart, where ancient light still lingers, a place that calls to us softly through every story, every painting, every film, every whispered bedtime tale, a place that is neither lost nor found, but always drifting just beneath the surface of our collective imagination. Atlantis, in its quiet global journey, has become the same thing. In every culture, a gentle reminder that mystery survives, not because it hides, but because we seek it. And perhaps that is why the myth never settles, never hardens into a fixed shape, never becomes one definitive version that belongs to a single people or a single time. It adapts, the way water adapts to the vessel that holds it, flowing into cultures, into stories, into dreams, with a grace so natural that most people never notice. The shift taking place. In South America, Atlantis whispers through Andean legends of cities of light hidden in the mountains, in stories of ancestors who crossed great waters before memory began. Some believe the myth travelled here, long before books, carried in the breath of travellers or in the deeper currents of universal human longing. In Africa, Atlantis echoes through tales of sunken kingdoms and islands swallowed by storms, stories not of punishment, but of transition, of worlds moving beneath the surface to become invisible, yet never absent. These stories speak not of loss, but of transformation, as if the sea were not a grave, but a doorway. In Oceania, the myth finds kinship with ancestral stories of voyagers who navigated thousands of miles, guided only by stars, stories of lands that rose and fell. With the moods of the Pacific, Atlantis feels different here, less a ruined empire, more a reminder that the ocean itself is alive, ancient, and endlessly aware of the worlds it has carried and reclaimed. The more Atlantis spreads, the less it resembles a single narrative, and the more it becomes a shared emotional landscape. People do not repeat the myth because they seek proof. They repeat it because it gives shape to something delicate inside them, a memory beyond memory, a longing beyond time. And so the myth continues, drifting through continents and across languages, softening as it goes, gathering new colours, new meanings, new quiet truths. Atlantis is no longer a city. It is a feeling the world keeps choosing to remember,